For those of you who haven't made it down to the newsagents, the front pages as usual, and the Sunday Express really encapsulates Theresa May's message to Tory waverers. It's now or never on Brexit. She could have written that herself virtually. The Sunday Telegraph picks up something she has written herself, her piece that you were just hearing about. May begs patriotic MPs to back deal. The Sunday Times here, back my Brexit, or we will never leave, says May. Rare unanimity on most of the front pages there about Brexit. The Observer has got a different take. The EU are wargaming, it says, for the fall of the May government, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. The Mail on Sunday believes that comic relief is basically a left-wing plot by the BBC, so there you go. I'm going to say nothing about that. And lots of papers have the same, more or less the same kind of front page, reflecting on Christchurch. There's the Sun on Sunday, hate will not win, and the little boy there, one of the victims, 3-year-old. And again, there's the Sunday Mirror, Mukad 3 ran for his life, but he had no chance. And I think we should start with that story, Ayesha. It has absolutely appalled everybody, of course. And one of the questions is, does it matter to us here? It's the other side of the world, but it has big implications for Muslims here, of which you're one. Absolutely.
I mean, it was such a grotesque incident. When I woke up to the news, I have to say, I was not that surprised. I have felt a great anxiety about something like this happening. I think anyone who is of the Muslim community has felt that Islamophobia has been rising. There's been sort of a boiling frog syndrome. It has been rising and rising and rising. There are all these tropes about how if you're Muslim, somehow you're predisposed to terrorism, or language like Muslims are invading countries. Well, as a Muslim, I tell you this, we do not come to invade your country. We come to make a better lives for ourselves, to look after you when you're ill, to feed you late night food, to drive your cabs, to run your corner shops. We come and we serve communities, yet we are demonised, dehumanised and now terrorised. And I'm afraid we all have to take responsibility for this. Media platforms, the mainstream media, commentators and politicians. I was appalled that a prime ministerial hopeful Boris Johnson made very insulting comments about Muslim women last year. There is a long gap between those kind of comments and what happened in Christchurch. I mean, it is different. And we also have to remember that the radicalisation of Islamists and the radicalisation of white extremists has been quite similar in some respects. It comes from the internet, it comes from, as it were, propagators of hate. The one thing I will say is if you speak to experts, the cues that leaders give are very, very influential. But you're right, social media has played a big part. Look, I don't think social media has created these bad feelings. There were always people in society that had these bad feelings, but now, with social media, they can find each other, they can form communities, they can intensify. And what's really interesting today, Reuters is reporting that the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is actually wanting to discuss the live streaming of this massacre on Facebook. And I'm afraid social media giants are going to have to face up to their responsibility. And I do also want to say that I think Jacinda Ardern has handled this with such humanity and empathy, and I think the Muslim community and the rest of the world has been very impressed with her reaction.
Amanda. There is a problem with her, with this news that came out today, that she actually got this email and she dealt with it within 2 minutes, but there are a lot of questions being asked about how quickly she actually reacted to that. And, you know, she's been brilliant. She's been such a human face. But
I don't know if that would have necessarily stopped what happened.
And she admitted they only have a tiny counterintelligence.
Let's look about how the papers have handled this. There's been huge coverage in the papers, focusing not just on the victims and how it all happened, but also on the killer himself and those strange manifestos that he's picked up online and from France and elsewhere.
Well, it's interesting because his manifestos, this manifesto is a smorgasbord of a lot of things. But as you were saying, what's very interesting is there's often commonality. You know, extremism ends up sort of meeting
in the middle.
In the middle. And that's something that's very interesting. But it is worrying that he does cite, he's obviously travelled around Western democracies, and as you said in your intro, there is this growing hate in Western democracies, which he seems to have picked up and put together.
It's the same obsession with kind of almost Dark Ages or medieval history. He's obsessed by the Battle of Tours, when the French took on the Saracen invaders, and a lot of Islamists go on and on and on about the victories of Saladin. They both look back more than 1,000 years for their historical promptings.
Yeah, they do. I think they look back, they sort of pick and choose. It's sort of lots of ignorance building up. And they don't have a great sort of historical knowledge about what has happened. It's all this weird stuff from the past. It's these icons. And it's this very hardline anti-immigration rhetoric. It's very interesting that in his travels, he was, he was in countries like Hungary, and there's a huge kind of anti-immigrant,
exactly.
Viktor Orban. So I'm afraid we're going to have to start joining up the dots.
And before we join up the dots, we're going to return to Brexit. However, Amanda Platell, lots of front pages, as I say, basically saying the same thing. Theresa May is grinding the opponents of her deal harder and harder and harder. She's telling them, if you don't vote for this, you're going to end up with no Brexit at all. The Chancellor's got billions of pounds to spend if the deal goes through, and they are falling one by one by one, aren't they?
It is an extraordinary week that we've had, and looking forward to next week. The number of times, Andrew, I've sat on your sofa in the last 18 months and have been briefed all over the weekend before I did it by ministers and cabinet ministers saying she'll be out before the end of the week. Well, I can say now that they're all saying she'll still be here at the end of the week. They think that she's got a good chance of getting a deal through. They think that she'll be still there by May and perhaps even Christmas. It seems as though she's managed to, I mean, this is, even though she wrote a piece for the Sunday Telegraph, it was extensively briefed everywhere. And she's just basically saying, you either back my deal or you lay open the trap that it will be delayed eternally. So first of all, 2 years.
And that threat is working,
and it's working. It's completely working. You've got, they say less polite things on the phone, but, ministers are saying, we're going to hold our nose. The deal stinks. We've always thought it would stink. But what the alternative is so much worse. Okay. But there are conditions that they also want in this. These people who are going to now back Theresa May's deal, who would normally not have, they want to clear out of the cabinet. They want some of the traitors sacked. And
there's a suggestion in the Sunday Times, she says at one point in this that she's going to have a new sense of discipline in the cabinet.
Well, she has to exert her authority. I mean, David Davis has written in the Sunday Times as well, but this narrative goes through them where they're saying, OK, she can't sack everybody who voted against her because she'd have no one left. But they're very, very keen. And I'm afraid that one of your guests today, the Chancellor, is one of the names that the Brexiteers want sacked because they believe he's done a huge amount to block Brexit.
Well, we can talk about that with him later on. Adam, what's the view in Brussels of all of this? The Observer has got a leaked memo about the future of
yeah, so the front page of the Observer, they're talking about this idea that Brussels is wargaming for the end of Theresa May's prime ministership. Now, there was a meeting of ambassadors on Monday morning last week where somebody raised this concept and used the phrase the post-May government. So there's been a bit of a conversation about it. I think wargaming it and having a big strategy for Mrs May being gone at a certain date, that is going too far. But on the inside of the Observer, we've got Dan Boffey, who was there in Strasbourg on Monday night, where I was at the press conference with Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the Commission, where they unveiled the reassurances that Theresa May had secured about the Irish backstop.
They're not enough reassurances.
And that was pretty clear. And it fell to me with the first question to say, Prime Minister, have you got a time limit to the backstop? Have you got an exit clause for the UK? And I got the prime ministerial death stare.
That's scary.
Yeah.
That's scary.
But then, of course, like everything in Brexit, there was this massive moment, midnight press conference in Strasbourg. A day later, gone, forgotten.
I know.
Nothing has
Now
changed.
she's back again. She's resurrected. She's resurrected her authority, and she could win this vote.
She could win the
She
vote.
could win it.
None of us know.
None of us know. I mean, just to feed in what Labour is planning to do, because if she is going to win this vote, she does actually need to get some Labour rebels to come over. Now, the Labour rebels might have voted against a second referendum, but I find it unlikely that they would prop her up, save her skin right now. But what Labour are saying very interestingly is that I've just been speaking to Peter Kyle over the weekend. The Labour Party will whip to support an amendment by Peter Kyle and Phil Wilson, which essentially says to the Prime Minister, we'll vote to get your deal through Parliament, then you have to give it to the public for a final
on her deal.
say, and then that confirms it and that ratifies it. Now, I know last week people felt that the second referendum died a death. There's going to be a big march this week, but it is interesting that Corbyn has now said that the Labour Party will whip to support this. And the Labour Party's been much tougher with its front benches than the Conservatives have.
You heard it here first, folks. The other big question, Adam Fleming, is what kind of extension the EU might give Theresa May if she goes back after losing again and says, I need another extension. I possibly can get it through. It depends what she says, I suppose.
Yeah, the problem the EU have is that Article 50 of the treaty, which sets the ground rules for this whole process, says it takes 2 years and then the departing member state and the other member states can agree to extend that process. That's it. It says nothing about duration, renewability, attachability of conditions. So that is what the 27 are grappling with at the moment. And they'll decide on Thursday.
We've had people like Donald Tusk suggesting that a 1 year or 2 year extension might be a good idea, clearly hoping that in that time Britain decides not to leave the EU at all. And we've got other people going for a short extension. But can I just ask about the European elections? Because that comes up quite soon. And if we extend even for a relatively short period, we might have the situation where Britain, having decided to leave the EU, having nothing to do with the European Parliament, is nonetheless obliged to elect MEPs. Very low turnout. It'd be very interesting to see what kind of people would then be returned to Strasbourg.
Well, and there's differing legal advice from the different EU institutions. So the Commission, the guardians of the treaties, the rule keepers, they say if the UK is in the EU on the 23rd of May, when we would have been having European Parliament elections, they'll have to take place. The European Council say, actually, you can have until the 1st of July because the new MEPs don't take up their seats until the 2nd of July. And then the European Parliament themselves say, it doesn't matter if there's no UK MEPs at all, the Parliament can still function.
Utterly astonishing. Can I just ask, you spent a lot of time with Michel Barnier's team.
Chasing Michel Barnier.
Michel Barnier.
He chases him down the street.
You've never managed to chase him onto the sofa here yet. What's his mood about all of this? Is he in despair?
Team Barnier were exceptionally depressed on Tuesday night when the second defeat of the vote went through. But they've dusted themselves off and now all the focus is on how will they make this extension work. And I think what leaders will do on Thursday when they're presented with this option is they will agree to the concept of an extension to Article 50, but it will be the UK to decide what they do with it. Is it to pass meaningful vote 3 or 4, or to have a referendum, a revocation, or a big rethink?
This is probably the least appropriate metaphor, but it reminds me a little bit of the Battle of Waterloo, all of this, and the Duke of Wellington. Hard pounding, gentlemen. Let's see who can pound the longest. Thank you all very much indeed. To the